right, guys. Today's class is going to be on the Articles of Confederation, and you all are already familiar with these. I hope you remember some things about them. But, of course, the Articles of Confederation was the first form of government that the United States, as the United States, had. Okay, so I'm going to just briefly go through a little timeline. I do want you to write it down. You should have it in your notes. I know a lot of you are doing your notes on your iPad. You could do this vertically instead of horizontally, but I still want to see a timeline. Okay, so anyway, just quickly, 1775, if you remember, that's Lexington and Concord. That was the first battle of the American Revolution. The American Revolution actually started before we declared independence. So from 1775 until 1781, the Battle of Yorktown, that was the American Revolution, that time period. In 1776, we declared our independence. But this is the date I want us to focus on right now, 1777. If you think about it, our founding fathers that put all of this together, that met at the First and Second Continental Congresses that you've already looked at a little bit, their main goal in governing during the revolution, during the actual fighting, was survival. You know, let's make it to the next day, because obviously the British would have loved to have captured them, probably hung them publicly, and the revolution probably would have been over. So anyway, they didn't worry too much about making laws and passing bills and taxing all the people and doing all those things that our government worries about today. But they were more or less worried about survival. But in 1777, they do develop a plan for when the war is over, that we will be a confederation, not a republic, really. I mean, it was a confederacy. It was a confederal republic, and we kind of looked at that a little bit earlier in the year. But so they're going to develop that in 1777, but it isn't really ratified until 1781, and that's because they had to get the new states that had been the colonies, they had to get their approval. So anyway, this is written, put into place in a way, but actually formally started in 1781. I do want you to remember that, those two dates. It was written, they came up with the plan in 1777, but it's fully ratified and ready to be our government in 1781. And one of the first successful things that under the Articles of Confederation happens is we do negotiate a peace treaty with England that formally ends the war. And of course, that's the Treaty of Paris. So this is one of the successes, if you will, of the Articles of Confederation, and there aren't very many. So we do want to remember this one, okay? Now, from 1781 then until 1787, I don't know if my timeline, you're running out of space. There you go. From 1781 to 1787, we operate as a country under the Articles of Confederation. But there are multiple problems with the Articles, and we're going to look at those here in just a minute. But because of that, one of the biggest things that's going to happen this time period right here is Shays' Rebellion. Daniel Shays, and actually his last name was with an S. Daniel Shays in Massachusetts led a rebellion against all forms of government. And they were farmers, and they were being taxed, and they were losing their property. And as a result of that, they revolted against the government of Pennsylvania. Well, the reason why this was so significant was the federal government, the government under the Articles, that would have been the government over all 13 states, didn't have the power to put together an army to go and squash this rebellion. I'm sure other people were unhappy in other states. So this rebellion could have spread. We could have had our first little civil war under the Articles of Confederation, and maybe our country would not even have survived a few years. So when Shays' Rebellion took place, our founding fathers realized we had to do something. And so they called for a convention, a constitutional convention in Philadelphia in 1787. This rebellion started in 86 and kind of spread into 87. And that's when they decided that they were going to meet and supposedly fix the articles to where they weren't as weak. There were several people that didn't like this. There were several founding fathers that did not like this idea. They thought, I smell a rat in Philadelphia, was what Patrick Henry, the voice of the American Revolution, who said, give me liberty or give me death. He said, I smell a rat in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia. And he wouldn't go. He wouldn't attend the meeting. But they are going to get together and they hash it out from May to September. And of course they argue and they discuss and debate, and we'll talk more about that at another time. But they come up with some compromises that they can all agree to. One of them that they wanted to agree to was slavery. They wanted to do away with slavery in 1787, but they knew that if they'd done that, the entire South would have left. And so our country would have gotten started already with a split, with a terrible split. So they decided to ignore slavery for this time period. But anyway, so it does take them from May to September to hash it out. And the date I want you to remember, it's very, very important. And we still celebrate it every year. We just did last month. September 17th is Constitution Day. It's the day that they finally came up with a document we call our United States Constitution, that we have 2 chapters that we're starting to talk about in your book on the Constitution, and it's very important, of course. It is our supreme law of the land. It doesn't override the Bible, we know that, but the Bible tells us that we are to submit to those in authority over us, and we are supposed to follow the Constitution. Everybody, the president, the Congress, the courts, everybody that has power, and everybody that doesn't have any political power or any type of power, everybody in the United States of America has to follow or is supposed to follow the Constitution. So it was adopted, now not ratified, and that's important. It was adopted September 17th, 1787, and our founding fathers signed it. But it does not go into play. It takes 2 years almost to get it ratified because all the states have to accept it. Or, well, let me back up. 9 out of 13 states have to accept it in order for it to pass, in order for it to be ratified. But our founding fathers weren't happy with just 9. They wanted all 13 to accept it. And so that's going to happen in 1789. All 13 states are going to ratify the Constitution. And so this is what I want you to remember. I don't know how much of this you can see. You can't see me doing that. From 1777 until 1789, we're under, in the United States of America, our government is under the Articles of Confederation. And it wasn't like the government that we have today. But in 1789, all 13 ratified it. And then 2 years later, a Bill of Rights was added to it. And that's the first 10 amendments. And we'll look at those later on. But anyway, so you've got to know that timeline. Now, let's quickly look at why they got rid of it. Why did they get rid of the articles? And this is where you need your books. Page 63. On page 63, it talks about the weaknesses of the articles. And so I want us to look at those, and you'll need to write certain things down, or at least have some of this in your notebook. And I'm sure you guys have figured out how to cut and paste, and that's fine, but there's nothing like writing it down to help you remember it. So even if you cut and paste this into your notes, that's fine, but you need to, beside it, shorthand it, what I'm going to give you. put beside it what you really need to remember. Okay, so it lists a bunch of the weaknesses. Like I said, one of the successes was the Treaty of Paris. They also negotiated 2 land ordinances. I'm not going to focus on that too much, but one was the Northwest Ordinance and one was just the Land Ordinance, and it basically designated how states and territories would be brought into play. You know, we were just 13 states at that time. We've got a lot of states to add. Of course, we don't know that. We assumed that, I guess. They knew that there was going to be more turf coming into the country. And so they set up a way in which a territory could be organized, and then a way in which from a territory, a state could be organized. And so that was part of the Northwest Ordinances that they developed. So those were the successes, and that was really about it. Because if you remember, in the Treaty of Paris, there were 2 conditions. One condition said that the British soldiers would leave, that they would go back to England if we paid some of the expenses of the war. Remember, that's really how it all kind of got started anyway. They wanted us to pay for some of the expenses of the French and Indian War. So they negotiated and they made a deal that we would assume some of the cost of the war, and we would send England some money, and in return, the soldiers would leave. Well, neither one of those 2 things were happening. We weren't able to raise any money to pay off our debts. And so right off the top, under the articles, we were losing credibility. The other countries were saying, you know, are you guys 1 country or 13? You're all different over there. Okay, we'll get to that here in just a minute. Okay, Congress was unable to take action directly against individuals. I'm not going to ask you to know that. But Congress lacked power to enforce the law. And you guys know, if somebody makes a rule, but nobody enforces it, everybody breaks it, okay? Because that's our old sin nature. So Congress didn't have any authority, any power to enforce a law that they made. Congress, the next one is very important too. Congress lacked power to raise revenue through taxes. Now, I hate taxes, but we need them because we all enjoy some things and we all need to pay for those things. And so there's some services that we do need to pay for. And it's when Congress overreaches their authority and wants to provide too many things that we get into trouble. But anyway, Congress lacked the power to regulate commerce. They had no power. If one state was cheating another state, there was nothing they could do about it. When they traded, commerce, you know, is trade. Congress, the next one is very important. You'll need to know this. Congress lacked power to raise military forces. Remember Shays' Rebellion. They couldn't raise an army. Now, you think, okay, well, they had an army. They obviously had an army. That's how we won the war. Well, to be honest, the way we won the war was a providence of God. Providentially, the Lord enabled our puny little weak-kneed country to be able to fight the largest and best military at the time and win. So, I mean, it's just a miracle that the things that happened. But still yet, one of the reasons everybody had a vested interest in that. If there was some other need, if Spain invaded Georgia, it would have been very difficult to get people from Massachusetts to go down there and push the Spanish out of Georgia. Okay, the people in Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, they would have said, that's your problem. Now, it would have become their problem when Spain was coming into their state, but you know, they had no vested interest. And so if you don't have an organized way in which you can compel people to fight, they're probably not going to. Okay. regardless of size, this one's very important too. Regardless of size, each state had one vote in Congress. So little bitty old Rhode Island had one vote, and big old Georgia had one vote. And that wasn't really fair because there was a lot more people in some of these other states, and they basically were not being represented. So regardless of size, each state, one vote. And the next one is very important. Unanimous agreement of states was needed to amend, to fix anything in the articles. They had to have all 13 states agree to it. Well, that was nearly impossible. There was no provision for national courts. So we had no federal judiciary. There was no Supreme Court. There was also no president, no executive. I don't think it has that in this list, but you should put that in there too. There was no president. We had one Congress, and it was one House, and that's the next one, I think. Congress consisted of only one House. It was unicameral. And so, it was unicameral, and everything had to be unanimous, which is, again, that's nearly impossible to get people to unanimously agree to anything. And so that just wasn't working well at all. Articles were not ratified by the people. They were ratified through organizations of the conventions within the now new states. I'm not going to ask you to know that one. You do need to know that Congress was unicameral. Congress lacked the sole power to coin money. Okay, what that means is every state had its own money. So if you went from Virginia to Georgia, you had to have your money converted into their money. Can you imagine the confusion? So every state had their own coinage. Every state had their own money. Or they could do it that way if they wanted to. So Congress lacked the sole power to coin money. One of the things in our Constitution is if we make our own money, they call that counterfeiting, and they put us in prison. Okay. And governments lacked separation of powers. Again, there was no other power. There was no executive branch. There was no judicial branch. Not in the federal government. Now, I don't mean there was no courts at all. States still had courts. One of the things we're going to look at as we study this year, and we'll talk on this at every term because this is really important. We still deal with this today. The whole concept of a republic, a federal republic that we became when we tossed the Confederacy out, when we tossed the Confederal Articles of Confederation, when we tossed that out and we became a federal republic. Federalism means that we have that division of power. We have a central government, a federal government that's over everybody. It's over the entire country. That's, of course, headquartered in Washington. And then below that, you do have a state government. We have a government in Charleston. We have a governor. We have a court system. We have a legislature. And then below that, you have a county government. We have a sheriff. We have county ordinances. And then below that, you have a city government. That's federalism. That's a very important concept in government. You've got to remember that because those four entities, they oftentimes fight with one another. They disagree with one another. They take each other to court over issues. The state government says to the federal government, you guys are abusing your power. And, you're doing something you're not supposed to be doing. And so they take them to the court. Think about what's going on. Our next think tank stuff is going to be about immigration. You must be looking at information and studying what's happening on our southern border even right now. There are literally tens of thousands of people that are right now headed to our southern border to come in, and there's already been tens of thousands of people that have come in, if not hundreds of thousands, and some of them have corona or COVID or whatever you want to call it, or the China virus. But anyway, but what I'm saying is, think about these immigrants that are coming to the Texas border. They're moving into Texas. They're doing whatever they want to the people that live along the border. They're going right through their property. They're destroying property. It's not all of them. Not all of them. Some of them are not, but some of them are. But the federal government, we, in our Constitution, we have a closed border. And it's the president's job to enforce that law, and he's simply not doing it. And so the states are at odds, all of the border states are at odds with the federal government right now, because look what's happening to them. But anyway, we'll talk about more of that with the think tank. Now, let's see, where are we? Okay, I think I got all of those, the weaknesses, and I gave you the strengths, or I gave you the positive things, the land ordinances and the Treaty of Paris. That's the main things. But I do want you to know that under the Articles, we had no president. Everything had to be unanimous. They had to unanimously agree to everything. They didn't have the power to tax. They didn't have the power to raise an army. They couldn't regulate commerce. They had no authority over that at all. I mean, it really was making us on the world stage look incapable, look incompetent. We weren't able to do our jobs. Like I said, other countries were saying, are you guys one country or 13 countries? So the Articles were bad. And the one thing about the Articles, and Patrick Henry may have been right, the Articles are going to give the federal government a great deal more power. Now, it's still supposed to operate like a federal republic, and I think we went over this. I know we did. The federal republic, in your imagination, pretend these boxes are of the same size. In a federal republic, the federal government, this would be D.C., Virginia, South Carolina, Massachusetts. In a federal government, they're supposed to be equal, all right? But over time, and we'll look at that as we get into how our government has changed over time, this box has grown bigger and bigger, because the federal government has gotten more and more and more power. And what they're trying to do in Washington right now, with pass this huge spending bill, would give the federal government tremendous more power. Thank goodness, I have to give him a plug. Joe Manchin is holding the line on this. And he's one of two. There's two moderate Democratic senators that are refusing to go along with this huge, enormous spending that they want to do in Washington. And let's pray that they make some wise decisions. We do need to pray. I do hope you guys are praying for our country. We need to pray for our country every day. Okay, so watch this video, summarize the Articles, and I am going to have you to write a paper on the Articles, and I'll put that on LMS later. I'll put it later today when I put this on there. You need to summarize why we did away with the Articles, why the Articles were ineffective, what was wrong with them. It won't take you long to write that. I'd say 100 words will get it, but be thorough, be complete, get it all. Write well. You guys are seniors. You guys can write well. You need to do that. Don't say he did this, they did that, she did this. Say who he and they and she are. Say the Founding Fathers. Say the Constitutional Convention. Don't say it. Well, what in the world's it? Always add that part in there, the definers, the things in your paper, any paper you write, even if it's a one-sentence thing. Be specific. It sounds so much better. It gives you so much more credibility. When I start to read a paper and it starts off with "it was," I just want to throw it in the trash. I really do, because I'm thinking, what's it? Now, I know I've asked the question, and the question is up above it, but pretend I don't have the question. Pretend I don't know what you were asked. Pretend that I have to understand your answer simply from your answer. So if you're talking about, the moon is made out of cheese, don't say it is made out of cheese, because that might be the block of cheese that you have in your hand. Say the moon is made out of cheese. And please don't add that into your paper today. Okay, enough.